I was in the middle of cleaning the house when I first noticed how quiet everything had become. The house felt too still, too perfect, as if nothing in the world was moving. I picked up my vacuum, its hum filling the silence as I pushed it back and forth across the carpet. My husband was at work, and my stepson, who was home for the semester break, was somewhere in the house. I couldn't quite place where exactly. The house was large, and I often lost track of him. I focused on my task, letting the mundane routine of cleaning settle my mind. I'd been with my husband for a few years now, and while our life together had a rhythm, it was nothing like it used to be. I hadn't realized how much of a stranger I had become in my own home until I started cleaning the corners, tidying up the spaces I once shared with my first husband before life and circumstances pulled everything apart. I wondered sometimes if my stepson felt as out of place in our home as I sometimes did. He was in his early 20s, a quiet boy with a cool, detached air about him. His father's son, but he never really let anyone get close. He preferred staying in his room, buried in his books or playing video games in the basement. Our conversations were brief, and while we were cordial, there was an invisible distance between us, a line neither of us ever crossed. I had no illusions about it. Being a stepmother was hard. We both tried to make it work, but there was always something awkward in the air whenever we interacted. As I worked through the living room, I couldn't help but notice the odd moments that had started to accumulate in recent weeks. Small things that, at the time, seemed insignificant but, in hindsight, felt like a subtle shift. I caught him looking at me a few times, but it was always quick, as if he was trying to hide it. Sometimes, I'd hear his footsteps just a little too close when I was moving around the house, and when I'd turn around, he'd be there, staring at me like he'd been caught off guard. When he spoke to me, his voice had an unfamiliar tone, soft, almost hesitant. It wasn't until I thought about it, after the confession, that I realized he'd started to compliment me more often, telling me I looked nice when I wasn't even dressed up, offering me a strange, quiet smile when our paths crossed. But I never let myself believe anything more than simple politeness. I was a woman of experience, used to reading the signs of a man's intentions, and this was not that. Still, there was something about the way he watched me, something I couldn't ignore. I assumed it was just a phase, something temporary, a young man's awkwardness around an older woman who happened to live under the same roof. I kept my distance, smiled politely, and didn't question it. The last thing I wanted was to overthink something trivial. I tried to focus on the dusting, the sweeping, and the organizing, hoping the mundane tasks would keep my thoughts from wandering too far. My husband had always been the focus of my affection, even though our connection had dwindled over time. I sometimes wondered if he still noticed me, or if I had become just another part of the furniture. It wasn't a bad marriage, just a quiet one. I had come to terms with that reality, but every now and then, I craved something more. Something that felt alive, something that could stir me from the inside out. But I never thought I would find that spark here, not from him. It was only when I heard his voice break through the quiet hum of the vacuum that I realized just how much I'd been ignoring. He appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain, standing in the shadows. His eyes met mine briefly before he quickly dropped his gaze. I couldn't quite make out what was in his expression. I turned the vacuum off, waiting for him to speak, wondering why he was standing there when he usually kept to himself. For a moment, I thought maybe he was about to apologize for some past awkwardness or try to make small talk, but there was something else in his posture. Something that felt different from every other interaction we'd had. His lips parted as if he was going to say something, but then he hesitated, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my stomach twisted with unease. He just nodded, but there was something in the air now. Something heavier than the silence. My heart started to beat a little faster, as if my body was sensing the change before my mind could catch up. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift in a way I wasn't prepared for. At that moment, I realized that life in this house had always been easy because of the distance between us. We were strangers living under the same roof, and that made everything easier. But now it seemed that distance was about to be tested. He stood there for a moment longer, not saying anything, just looking at me. There was a palpable tension in the air, thick and unspoken. I could feel my pulse quicken, and despite the warmth of the house, I felt cold. My eyes tried to focus on his face, but they kept darting away, unable to meet the intensity of his gaze. Something was different, and I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Then finally he spoke. "Can we talk?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clear enough. His words hung in the air between us, charged with an unease that made my throat tighten. I nodded instinctively, even though a part of me wanted to turn away and escape. I couldn't. I didn't want to seem rude. He stepped closer, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. The silence between us stretched too long, too uncomfortable. I could feel his eyes on me, watching me carefully, as though searching for something. What? I wasn't sure. He had always been distant, quiet, and now he felt suddenly close, as if he had crossed some invisible line. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my voice sounding almost too high-pitched, betraying my growing unease. He shook his head, but his lips pressed together in a way that made me nervous. I've been meaning to tell you something," he said, and I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. I wasn't prepared for what came next. Not at all. "I don't know how to say this," he continued, his voice shaking just slightly. "But I can't keep it inside anymore." I could hear the way his breath hitched, as if he was trying to steady himself, as if the words he was about to say were as difficult for him to speak as they were for me to hear. I looked at him, trying to make sense of the words that were forming in my head. There was something in his eyes now, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just a boy's uncertainty. There was something more there. I felt it even before he spoke. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "And it's hard to say, but I can't stop feeling this way." His words hit me like a slap, and my mind immediately went into overdrive. My chest tightened, and I had to fight to steady my breath. I think I have feelings for you," he said finally, almost too quietly. The words came out clumsy, awkward, but undeniably clear. It felt like the world had just stopped spinning. His confession hung in the air like a weight I couldn't escape, suffocating the space between us. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. My heart was racing, my thoughts scattered in every direction, none of them making any sense. The weight of the words he'd just said pressed down on me like a stone in my chest. He had feelings for me. It wasn't just some careless remark or a slip of the tongue. It was real, and now everything felt irreversibly different. I walked away from the room, feeling like I needed to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the house suddenly felt too close, too stifling. I needed space, needed time to think. I found myself in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, but I couldn't find a single coherent thought. What was I supposed to do now? The anger was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, but it was mixed with something I wasn't ready to confront. I had always seen him as just a boy, my husband's son. I never thought of him in any other way. But now I was forced to reckon with a truth I didn't want to accept. How had things gotten to this point? My relationship with my husband had always been stable, albeit ordinary. We'd settled into a rhythm, comfortable but not passionate. There had been moments in the past when I'd felt lonely, when I'd questioned whether the spark was gone between us, but I never entertained the idea of straying. I never thought about anyone else. But now, with my stepson's confession weighing on me, I found myself questioning everything. The silence of the house was oppressive. I realized I was alone. My husband still at work, my stepson retreating to his room, likely as confused and hurt as I was. My thoughts spiraled again. Was I somehow responsible for this? Had I ignored the signs, let something slip by because I was too busy with my own life to notice? It wasn't like I'd been completely unaware of his behavior in recent weeks, but I dismissed it. I hadn't wanted to read too much into it. But now it all made sense. The lingering glances, the compliments, the moments of closeness that made me uncomfortable. He had been trying to tell me something, and I had ignored him, thinking it was nothing. But this wasn't nothing. This was everything. I thought about his words, the guilt, the desperation in his voice when he said he couldn't help how he felt. It tore at me. Part of me wanted to run, to shut it all out, but I couldn't. His confession had stirred something in me. There was a flicker of something. Was it sympathy? Or something deeper? Something I shouldn't have been feeling? I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, trying to focus. No. This wasn't right. I couldn't allow myself to get swept up in this. I had to be strong. This was a test of boundaries, of loyalty, of everything I believed in. I had to remind myself of who I was supposed to be. A wife. A stepmother. I couldn't cross this line. Not for him, not for anyone. But as I stood there, trying to hold on to some sense of clarity, I couldn't escape the quiet tug of temptation. Wasn't I just as lonely as he was? Hadn't I been craving something more for my marriage for a long time? My relationship with my husband had become comfortable, predictable. And while I didn't doubt his love for me, I couldn't ignore the lack of passion, the emotional disconnect that had settled in. It wasn't his fault, not entirely. But it was hard to ignore the way I felt, empty in a marriage that was supposed to be fulfilling. That was the problem. I was vulnerable. And so was he. Neither of us had been fully seen or heard. But none of this could justify what he had said, what he had felt. I had to separate those feelings from reality. I had to keep control, even if everything in me was screaming to just let it go, to let him in, to explore this strange, forbidden connection. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. There was no we in this. There couldn't be. I was a married woman, his stepmother. What had happened between us wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a boundary crossed, a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It didn't matter how much sympathy I felt for him or how much I questioned my own marriage. This wasn't something I could entertain. Not now, not ever. And yet, I found myself thinking about him again, his face, the way his eyes had looked at me when he spoke, the way his voice had trembled with emotion. I could still feel the weight of his confession, as if it was etched into the air. How could I erase that from my mind? How could I pretend it hadn't happened? But I couldn't allow myself to dwell on it. I had to act. I couldn't let this continue. He had made his feelings clear, and now it was my responsibility to set things right. I had to draw a line, make sure he understood that this wasn't something I could ever return. I stood there, gripping the counter, and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about him. It was about our family, about everything I had built. I had to be strong. For myself. For my husband. For the sake of everything that had come before. No matter how hard it was, I couldn't let this moment define me. I couldn't let it define us. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't ignore the situation any longer. The guilt gnawed at me, but it wasn't just guilt. It was the weight of responsibility. I had to address this before it festered and became something worse. I couldn't allow things to spiral, not when so much was at stake. My marriage, my family, everything that I had worked so hard to build could be destroyed in an instant if I didn't take control of the situation. I made up my mind. I needed to talk to him. He had to understand that what he had confessed was not something that could be overlooked or ignored. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something I could brush aside. His feelings, no matter how real they were, couldn't be reciprocated. I had to make that clear, for both our sakes. I found him in his room, sitting at his desk, staring at the screen of his laptop without really seeing it. He didn't notice me immediately, and I took a moment to gather myself, to steady my nerves. What was I going to say? How could I make him understand the gravity of what had happened between us without making it worse? Finally, he looked up, his expression faltering when he saw me standing in the doorway. He seemed to brace himself, like he expected me to yell or cry, but I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to give in to emotion. I couldn't. Can we talk? I asked, my voice steady, but there was a certain coldness in it, a firmness I hoped he would hear. He nodded, looking uncertain, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read. Maybe fear, maybe regret. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he understood the consequences of his actions. I took a step into the room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. It felt symbolic, a small action that signified the boundary I was about to draw. I wasn't just stepping into his space. I was setting a limit, an unspoken line that could not be crossed. I need you to understand something. I started, my words deliberate, my tone even. What you said earlier, it's not something I can just ignore. I can't pretend it didn't happen. I paused, watching his face closely. But I also need you to understand that this, what you're feeling, it isn't right. You're my stepson. I am married to your father. There's no place for this kind of connection between us. I need you to accept that. His face paled, and for a moment he looked